The national anthem has been a part of our American heritage for over 200 years. The national anthem is also known as the Star-Spangled Banner. This is a song that you will hear at sporting events, rodeos, memorial services, anything that has to do with America. This leads us to our question: why do Americans sing the national anthem? To find this question out, we need to go back in history to the time of 1812. This is when the War of 1812 happened. This war was over promises made but not kept. Many people consider this war the Second Revolutionary War. The British wanted to send out a convincing message to the United States of America that they were superior in their military. By the summer of 1814, the British invaded Washington, D.C. They burned down the White House and other Capitol buildings. They even chased President Madison and the First Lady out of Washington, and now they were headed to Baltimore. The British were headed to Baltimore, the third largest city in the U.S. at the time, to attack Fort McHenry. George Armistead, the commander of Fort McHenry, understood that the British at some point would probably attack Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry needed a flag. Commander Armistead asked a lady named Mary Pinkersville to make him two flags. One, a smaller one for stormy weather, and then also a larger one, which they called the garrison flag. The storm flag was 25 feet long by 17 feet wide. This was the smaller flag, which was used to be flown in stormier weather. The larger flag, which is the garrison flag, was an impressive 42 feet long by 30 feet wide. Armistead wanted that flag to be so large that he didn't want the British to miss it from a distance. He didn't want the British to lose their way and miss the fort. In 1814, when they came down from Washington, they tried to take the fort by land. That didn't happen because the Americans revolted and beat the British. The British couldn't capture Fort McHenry on land, so they tried their luck in the water. They had 16 of their best warships surrounding Fort McHenry. As the British soldiers came down from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, they captured many Americans and held them captive on these ships. One of the hostages that was held captive on the ship was Dr. William Bean. He was a friend of Francis Scott Key and John C. Skinner. Francis Scott Key, a lawyer, and John C. Skinner, a government agent, went aboard one of the British ships to negotiate for Dr. William Bean's. The two men successfully negotiated his freedom and release, but since the British fleet was about to launch an attack, all three were detained and placed in a British ship until the Battle of Fort Henry commenced. Early in the morning of September the 12th, 1814, the British launched their attack. The weather was awful. It was rainy and wet, so the Americans launched the smaller storm flag. The British, with their superior weaponry, could attack Fort McHenry while the American weapons couldn't even reach their ships. The British poured thousands of cannonballs and an ample amount of rockets in one unrelenting hail of firepower, smoke, and shrapnel onto Fort McHenry. This bombardment lasted 2 days, as Francis Scott Key and his two friends watched absolutely helplessly. After dark, on the evening of the second day, the firing finally stopped. Early the next morning, through the midst of smoke and fog, the young lawyer peered through his telescope to see if the flag was still standing. So, where did the national anthem come from? He couldn't tell if the flag was still standing or not because it was still dark. He pulled out a letter in his pocket and he began to write on the back of it. On the back of the letter in his pocket that he had, he wrote an inspiring message. "Oh, say can you see, by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we held at the twilight's, at last night's last gleaming." As he continued to peer through the telescope on that wretched morning, he soon saw the answer for himself. With all the joy in his heart, he noticed that the Americans took down the smaller storm flag and replaced it with the much larger, massive garrison flag. The flag waved proudly in the morning light on top of a 90-foot flagpole. The Americans celebrated by playing Yankee Doodle and firing their guns in the air. The Americans had taken the worst that the British could give them and not be defeated. After that momentous morning, the 3 Americans were finally released from that British ship. After their release, Francis Scott Keyes pondered on the immensity of what just took place. As he pondered, he wrote the rest of the national anthem, or the Star-Spangled Banner. Legend has it that American soldiers would die to hold those flags up. That is, one American soldier died to hold the flag up, another would come and take his place at Fort McHenry. But this isn't that hard to believe, because in our history, millions of Americans have died fighting valiantly for our flag and our freedom. Francis Scott Key's poem went on to become the Star-Spangled Banner. The poem was finally printed, and it was sung, ironically, to a popular British tune. By the 1890s, the military required that the song be played at the raising and the lowering of the flag. By 1960, President Woodrow Wilson required it to be played at all military ceremonies. And on March 3, 1931, President Herbert Hoover signed a federal law making the Star-Spangled Banner Americans' official national anthem. With all this history and this information, we can answer the question, why do Americans sing the national anthem?